On Saturday, federal agents shot and killed Alex Jeffrey Pretti, a 37-year-old ICU nurse, during an immigration protest in Minneapolis, an incident now at the center of a crisis for the Trump administration's enforcement crackdown and the nation more generally. Federal officials claim Pretti posed an imminent threat, but video footage tells a sharply different story. A man stepping up to protect a pepper-sprayed protester, hands visible, unarmed in the moment he was tackled and shot.
They are hitting that observer! They are kicking them in the face!
Jess, I'm not sure how to intro this. What are your thoughts?
I'm heartbroken for all of us, but especially for the people of Minneapolis. I have friends from there. I was having coffee with one of them yesterday who's in town to help someone else. And she just kept saying, words can't even describe what we're living through. Our city is under siege. And when you see footage like this, and thank God that people are videoing all of this, you see that that's really what's going on there. And we're being governed by ghouls, absolute ghouls, who do not care what reality is, what the facts on the ground are. Kristi Noem, I don't know how she can look herself in the mirror, these press conferences that she's given, and these ICE agents, CBP agents, I should say, so just federal agents. So just to be clear, because there are a lot of different law enforcement agencies that are flying around doing this immigration enforcement, we tend to focus on ICE, and for good reason. Like Jonathan Ross, who shot Renee Good, was an ICE agent. These are CBP agents who are supposed to operate within 100 miles of the border. And you would typically think about the southern border, right? Because that's where the bad hombres came from. But even so, Minneapolis is like 314 miles or something, about a 4-hour drive from the Canadian border anyway. So these guys just shouldn't be operating here. And I understand on a good day when things are in normal times and people are behaving like civilized human beings that wouldn't just go and execute an American citizen, it might be one thing to have CBP out there. But at this point, none of these guys should be around in any of these places. They should be nailed to the border doing the enforcement there. Canadian if you want, but certainly southern border. One clapped, one said boo-hoo, and then they expect us to believe that Officer Ross, who shot Renee Good, that it's not real, that he said fucking bitch as he walked away from her after putting 3 bullets in. It doesn't feel like this is American. It feels totally dystopian, and it's turning my mentality at least a bit into a Republican. I keep thinking about, Reagan saying the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. How could you possibly trust the federal government when you're seeing scenes like this? And I appreciated how many conservatives I've seen speaking out about it, just calling a spade, people like Tim Pool, who's a total lackey for the Trump administration. There have been gun groups that have come out and said this is exactly what the Second Amendment was for, right? To protect yourself against the tyranny of the government. But thank God for that footage, right? Seeing that the guy Pretti didn't have the gun. It had been taken away when he was shot, and you hear an agent going, where's the gun? Where's the gun? Well, shouldn't you know that before the guy gets 10 bullets in him? And I don't know if you saw the DHS post defending what happened. They showed a picture of the gun just sitting there, not actually where the gun was found or anything. They just put it in a spot so you can see, oh, he had a really scary weapon or whatever. I thought we were pro Second Amendment here. Guy had a lawful license to carry. I can't even keep myself straight. How are you feeling?
No, I thought it was remarkably cogent. I was talking to Catherine, or she was texting me before, the woman who kind of oversees everything at Prof G. And she brought up an interesting point. I've been for the last week on a bunch of panels and advocating for specific military intervention in Iran because the government is killing protesters. And Catherine correctly pointed out, you realize that in America, the government is killing protesters right now. And it kind of shook me about how I haven't been thinking as much about what could be done here. Obviously, there should be an investigation of which there won't be anything legitimate, at least not in the near future. But just looking at the video, what struck me was how highly untrained these men are. That the entire point of some sort of police force, even the Marines, is to typically, in most situations, is to de-escalate. And when you see the gun go off, you see all of them scatter. They clearly just don't know what to do. If you hear a gun go off, what you're trying to do is immediately find hands and debilitate that gun. But this was, oh no, shots fired, everybody run. So it just came across that these individuals just have absolutely no training. Representative Seth Moulton, I thought, had an interesting point, and he's a former Marine, and he said in Afghanistan, if you had a group of soldiers who handled an enemy combatant who'd been relieved of his weapon this way and put that many bullets into the person, that person would be court-martialed. So to think that these CPB agents are acting more violently and recklessly than Marines in highly dangerous hot zones in Iraq versus a suburb of Minneapolis just shows you how outrageous and out of line this type of behavior is.
Well, and also that they weren't doing the immigration enforcement that they were supposed to be there for. Like, they weren't busting into a house full of undocumented people that had been sodomizing children. They were on a Minneapolis street and they had already pepper sprayed a woman who was also a peaceful protester and then killed a nurse that works in the VA.
And then murdering an ICU nurse.
Right. Yeah, a 37-year-old ICU nurse. I mean, you couldn't have scripted it almost better for the level of insanity of what they did. That is the person that they ended up killing. And the family statement is very strong. By the way, I would recommend that everyone go and take a look at that. Maybe we can add it in here, where they just say the video is clear as day. He didn't have a gun in his hand. You'd already taken away his gun, which he has a legal right to have anyway, and his hand is up. The international symbol of I surrender, I come in peace, right? I'm not here to hurt you. You best not hurt me. And they killed him.
The word that struck me was cowardice, I think, for the president and Secretary Noem. If you're deliberate about violence, you might decide it's the wrong move, but at least you're deliberate about it. George Bush made no qualms or excuses for going in and killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqis under the auspice of what he said was a legitimate concern about weapons of mass destruction that ultimately ended up to be incorrect. But this is a special type of cowardice because this has nothing to do with immigration, right? My understanding is we were deporting more people during the Obama administration. This is about terror and some sort of performative, weird sort of macho or masculinity that gives you arm's distance from violence. You can claim this is about immigrants or have an agency that you purposely stalk with people. I can't even imagine the kind of psychological makeup of the people joining ICE right now who are deeply untrained. So I found the situation itself just so indicative of how poorly trained these individuals are. And this does seem like some sort of violence that is the worst type of violence. And that is no one willing to even acknowledge what it is or take, I don't know how to explain it, indirect violence or violence that has no purpose or attribution.
Yeah, they're just throwing shit at the wall. And anyone's humanity that isn't part of their core group is absolutely meaningless. There is no respect for human life unless it is high-end conservative life, as far as they're concerned. I mean, the average American doesn't matter a morsel to them. And that's so evident in all of this, because there are people out there who are protesting who are conservatives, who have voted Republican their whole lives, gun owners, churchgoers, all the things that the right tells us are so important in life. And you say that, this is about, terror and being able to wield power. Pam Bondi gave up the game today. She sent a letter to the Minnesota government saying, turn over their voter rolls. It's all about controlling elections, all about it so that they can stay in power forever, and probably that Donald Trump himself can stay in power forever. And when you look at the amount of time and energy and money and blood, sweat, and tears they have put into making us believe that this is, as you say, about immigration enforcement, and then just casually send a letter and say, like, also, if you just turn over this thing, it's just appalling. And I have another friend who's from Minneapolis who texted me and said, why is no one helping us? And I had no response for her. There's a protest right here going on by my house on Broadway. So, people are making their voices heard there. It's Snowmageddon tonight. They're out in the freezing cold doing that. But this has to change. This has to turn into a national movement in support of an American pushback on a tyrannical government. And I don't know how we let it, to some degree, get this wildly out of control. Like that Donald Trump, you legitimately won a free and fair election. People chose this. And maybe it was our fault, people with platforms and powerful voices, for not making it clear enough that it could end up like this. But that he has done this in 25% of his time in office. He has 3 more years. And you see the way that they're behaving. And Heather Cox Richardson, I think, said it best. She said, it's extra constitutionally now. There's no concern for the rule of the law. Judges are doing the best that they can. Actually, law enforcement has been speaking out against ICE. Everyone from the, corrections departments, local cops, former FBI, CIA, everybody is, I guess, saying what they can. But if you have people like that with 47 days of training who would say bye-bye and clap after an innocent man is murdered, no one is behaving within the bounds of the law. What can we do?
So I've been thinking a lot about that this weekend, and I think that what Governor Walz and the mayor of Minneapolis have suggested around keeping the district attorney around keeping tabs on the individuals who may have committed murder or at least reckless endangerment, that there is no, the immunity on murder is never. And this notion that Stephen Miller said you have federal immunity, I don't think there's any such thing. So I think it's smart for them to say, look, our memory is long and our reach is far. And keep in mind, there will be Democrats in charge at some point. I think that's really smart. I think the protests are inspiring. And Timothy Snyder says no major movement it really ever happens without protesters. I think where the innovation comes in, and what I would love to see some very powerful, vocal, and present or popular politicians call for, or public figures, is the third leg of the stool here. And I'm increasingly convinced that we need a national economic strike. So every few years, Americans rediscover protests, signs, chants, a lot of moral clarity. The problem is it feels powerful, but it's mostly ignored. And if you look at who is really controlling Trump and the government right now, it's much more about, we shouldn't be watching protests, we should be watching GDP. That the only audience he cares about is these titans of industry, and simply put, the only time he's ever switched or really U-turned on policy is when either the market crashes or the 10-year goes up or he gets calls from AI CEOs. So Trump doesn't respond to outrage. He responds to output or economics. And so the concept is not a labor strike. This isn't unions or picket lines or collective bargaining. This is an economic strike. It would be short-term, coordinated withdrawal from work, spending, and participation. You wouldn't have any slogans. You wouldn't have any signs, no marching, just, in a weird way, just less. And what you get here is real leverage. The U.S. economy is roughly $27 trillion a year. That's about $75 billion a day. And 2/3 of that, plus 70%, is consumer spending. So if you want to talk about what we have, strategies about the assets you have, and then cutting a swath between what are your assets and the marketplace. The assets that we have as concerned consumers is that we are, see above, consumers, which means even small changes in participation can have massive effects on the influences that actually influence Trump. So it would have to be coordinated, and multi-days. A one-day slowdown is annoying, but a multi-day slowdown is terrifying. And if you want proof for this, we have a very recent case study. We've run this experiment in the second quarter of 2020, Jess, when people stopped working and stopped spending. GDP fell 31 points annualized in one quarter. A tenth of that drop would absolutely terrify the administration. And it's not ideology or wishful thinking, it's math. Markets collapsed, Congress moved in days, trillions appeared overnight. Nothing in modern American history has moved policy faster than our GDP declining in 2020. And why does this work better than protest? Protests target politicians, economic withdrawal targets markets, and politicians can last, or they can wait out outrage. Markets can't ignore missed earnings. And a protest is a moral argument. A strike or a national strike is a financial one, and one that shows up on cable news. Or the protest, while they show up on cable news, the other shows up on earnings calls. And I believe that now earnings calls are much more important in America than what ends up on CNN. A sustained 5% drop in consumption erases roughly 1.3 trillion in annual GDP. And I think the call would be for wealthy people to reduce that substantially more, because lower and middle income people have a more difficult time reducing their spend. So this would be hard. It requires coordination because it's riskier, again, for people living paycheck to paycheck, but that's why it would be so effective. Power feels withdrawal more than resistance, in my view. And because resistance is noisy, but withdrawal is expensive. So I want to be clear. I don't have a specific ask here. It's more of an observation, and I'm not saying that it's easy, moral, or likely. But if you were really looking to be effective, in addition to being right, I think the history and the data are unambiguous. And that is, when nothing moves, everything listens. And you don't need permission to opt out. And the most radical act in capitalism is non-participation. In sum, I think it's time for a national economic strike. Your thoughts?
It sounds hard, but good. And for a way for it to be delineated, kind of like us versus them. Because I think that the lines are very blurry, and because the 2024 election, a lot of people who are traditional Democratic voters, moved over, and, everything's just a little bit more gray than it used to. I think it would send a very strong signal that this is not okay. This is not the way that we do things in America, and it's not what we want, certainly the next 3 years or the rest of our future to look like. I would add to it that a lot of these titans of business that you were in Davos with, they make comments every once in a while. I saw like Ken Griffin, talked about the tariffs and the impact of that. It'd be nice if talking about things like this, like executions of American citizens, also made way into the conversations about what's going on in the economy. Because CNN might not matter that much, but CNBC does, to your point about the money mattering and the markets mattering. I would also throw in that this DHS funding bill, there's a vote coming up. I think it's on Friday. Chuck Schumer has already said that he's a no. Michael Bennet said that he's a no. Martin Heinrich, no. Both senators from Nevada. So they shouldn't be able to get the numbers that they need for it. But if you thought that it was worth shutting down the government over healthcare, then it's definitely worth shutting down the government over what ICE is doing. And it is going to be very complicated to make sure that different parts of DHS are still funded. Like, we need TSA, and frankly, we need CBP, and we need to make sure that the bad hombres get out, because there are a lot of people in this country who are undocumented, who are doing truly terrible things. But you can't look at the way immigration enforcement is being executed in this country and say that without us getting to look under the hood of this and frankly shutting it down for a while, that you can continue to fund it in good conscience. And so, I know it's just a strongly worded letter, from Chuck Schumer, but I'm glad that he came out right away and just said, I'm a no. And we have to take a stand here the same way as over the Obamacare subsidies.
I agree. I just hope that they decide if it's worth doing on day one, it's worth doing on day 365, and they stick to their knitting. Just to bring back what I think could happen in 48 hours or 72 hours is, I believe it doesn't even require maybe even a national economic strike. I think if everyone who has the string that gets pulled on here and potentially crashes the economy is AI. America's now a giant bet on AI. And I realize I'm getting very tactical here, but the idea of a general economic strike is
People
pretty
want to know
vague.
what to do, though. So,
well, the simplest solution from A to B, if someone were to say, all right, what's the fastest, crispest way to get this to stop? I would say it's get as many people as possible to unsubscribe from OpenAI, from ChatGPT. Because if all of a sudden ChatGPT or OpenAI has to disclose that we've lost 10% of our subscribers, they'd have to disclose that to their investors. They're trying to raise 50 or 100 million at, I think, 750. It would immediately queer their financing round. The ripple through NVIDIA would happen. The ripple through Amazon would happen because they're deep into AI. Microsoft had hit it. And all of a sudden, overnight, the S&P would be off substantially because these companies now make up 40% of the S&P. The GDP begins to look like it's going to be negative. So all of a sudden, you have a market crash. You have the threat of a recession going into the midterms. You don't think Trump's going to notice that? I genuinely believe, Jess, that when he sees these people getting shot, or he sees this chaos, and he sees these protests, I think in a weird way, I think it not only emboldens him, I think he enjoys it. I think he conflates this type of coarseness and cruelty with masculinity.
Well, we saw that on January 6th.
And who does he listen to?
He was having a grand time.
He's obsessed with these CEOs. And these CEOs, what you just said was really powerful, that a place like Davos, you wish there would be more discussion of ICE. Granted, I tried to avoid most people, but I was in a lot of those meetings with some of the people and dinners with some of the people you mentioned. I didn't hear anyone talking about ICE. People were talking about capital formation as the secret to the U.S.'s success, and whether Carney won the day, won Davos, or Trump did, and Ukraine, and the New World Order, and reshifting supply chains around the U.S. because everyone's so sick of the U.S. It's really striking. I didn't hear anyone talk about ICE. I mean, granted, Finland isn't really worried about what's happening with ICE, but you would have thought that a lot of these Americans would have probably brought it up. But it struck me when you said that there wasn't a lot of discussion around that. Any other comments before we kick off here, Jess?
It's time to get noisy, to, act in any way that you can. And I hope that these prosecutors who are taking a stand, right, and are leaving their jobs because the Civil Rights Division of the DOJ doesn't care to do investigations, continue to make their voices heard, and maybe there's some kind of reversal. Maybe this execution is so stark and incontrovertible that there actually will be an investigation, but we should accept nothing less than people having to face a jury like all of us are supposed to, and they get their day in court, absolutely, but we need to have it. And they have Vance, Stephen Miller, Kristi Noem, Donald Trump. They have all been pushing for the ability to operate in the shadows where they can't be held accountable for anything. And we can't stand for that.
Let's leave it there. Subscribe to Raging Moderates to stay up to date with our latest coverage. Thanks for your time, Jess.
Yeah, see you soon.